B, Hebrews 6:11-15, expositors on these verses. We want each of you to show the same diligence to the very end in order to make your hope sure. We do not want you to become lazy, but to imitate those who through faith and patience inherit what has been promised. Inherit. You inherit eternal life by faith alone. You inherit rewards in heaven by being faithful. Hebrews 6:13. For when God made the promise to Abraham, since he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself. And what did he say? I will surely bless you and I will surely multiply you. And so, having patiently waited, he obtained the promise. Abraham, the promise of rewards, of possession of the eternal, promised land, eternal promised land. Verse 11, we want translates a verb that refers to strong desire. The writer was passionately concerned for his friends, a concern that has already appeared in verse 9, dear friends, literally beloved, and which we see again in his desire for each of them. No one is excluded. He calls on them to show the same diligence. The past had set a standard. He looks for it to be maintained to the very end. Persistently, he brings before them the importance of perseverance. This is for you and I as well. In order to make your hope sure, renders a somewhat unusual expression, to the fullness of the hope. The term plerophoria can mean a full assurance, as it does in 1 Thess 1:5, where the NIV has deep conviction. But here it is, in this passage, rather the full development of the hope. Notice that in these verses we have love, verse 10, and faith, verse 12, as well as hope. The three are often joined in the New Testament, as we see in these passages. It was thus evidently an accepted Christian practice to link just these three. In the 20th century, we would easily think of faith and love for a similar short list, but hope? Clearly, it had a greater significance for the early church than it has for us today. Hope is important. Probably no movement has ever gripped the hearts of people if it did not give them hope. And elpida in the Greek, when it appears in particular passages, is a sure hope, and that means a sure hope of your salvation. But there is no sure hope of getting your inheritance of eternal rewards, is there? It depends upon your faithfulness and perseverance. So, verse 12, the Greek does not have the verb want, as the NIV says, but the conjunction hina denotes purpose, in order that you do not become lazy. So the readers are to imitate those who get the promises, imitate and not simply follow. Faith is important throughout this epistle, and it is not surprising to have it included here as a more important part of the Christian life. It is probably faith in God, as is usual in this epistle, that is meant here. Patience or long-suffering points to a quality of being undismayed in difficulties. Wow, I need to work on that. Faith has a steadfastness about it that sees it through whatever difficulties present themselves. My faith is often lessened by the difficulties I have. Rather than to persevere because of my faith waxes and wanes because of my inability to persevere, because of the pain, and so on. The verb inherit is often used in the New Testament where there is no strict notion of inheritance, as here. It simply means to have sure possession of, without specifying the means. It is uncertain whether the allusion is to the great ones of the past, the faith chapter 11, Hebrews 11, or to outstanding contemporaries. Perhaps the present tips the scale in favor of those then living. The readers had good examples. Let them follow them. In the beginning, they started out well, but they're waxing and waning. Going back to the law is the question here. God's promise is sure. 6:13-20. Abraham is a splendid example of what the author has in mind. Though that patriarch had God's promise, he had to live for many years in patient expectation with nothing to go on except that God had promised. But that was enough. God is utterly reliable. What he has promised, he will certainly perform. But we must wait patiently, for he does it all in his own good time, not in ours. And in verse 13, the author is fond of Abraham, whom he refers to 10 times, a total exceeded only by Luke 15 and John 11. Abraham is the supreme example of one who continued to trust God and obey him, even though the circumstances were adverse, and gave little support to faith. Albeit, you remember Eliezer and Hagar, and going off to wait for his father to die, and then decided to obey. As he grew in years, also his faith grew. And all of a sudden, Sarah gives birth to Isaac, Abraham, Isaac, then Jacob. And then we have the Jewish nation who looked to Father Abraham for the extreme of faith. And of course, when he goes up, Abraham goes up to sacrifice Isaac, knowing that he was going to resurrect him from the dead, because Isaac was the son of the promise that would lead to Jesus Christ in the line of Abraham. So the New Testament often speaks of God's promise in connection with this man, Acts and Romans and so on. His greatness and frequency with which God's promise was linked with his name made him a natural example for the author. Just remember, there was no law during Abraham. He was justified by faith alone, as all are. So the law was not meant for a justification by keeping the law. It was meant to keep you in tow as Israel, with fellowship with God, and living the promises out, and getting blessed in this life. And then, if you were a believer, justification by faith alone, as Abraham was, then you get blessed with the inheritance of being co-owners of the promised land, and many other blessings. It is the fact of the promise rather than its content that the author appeals to, especially to the fact that God confirmed it with an oath. Westcott points out that the oath in itself implies delay in fulfilling the promise. If God had been about to fulfill it immediately, there would have been no place for an oath. So from the first, Abraham was faced with the prospect of waiting in hope and faith. And he's since gone on to be with the Lord. And there's no inheritance of the promised land yet. God swore an oath, the oath by himself, a point mentioned by Philo. In the Talmud we read, R. Eliezer said, Moses said before the Holy One, blessed be he, sovereign of the universe, hadst thou sworn to them by the heaven and the earth. And I would have said, just as the heaven and earth can pass away as can, so can thy oath pass away. Now, however, thou hast sworn by them by thy great name, just as thy great name endures forever and ever, so thy oath is established forever and ever. So the oath is that mentioned in Exodus 32:13 as well. So here it is significant that God swore by himself, but for the present, the author says no more than that there was no greater to swear by. So the quotation is from Genesis 22:17, that it was an oath is attested in Genesis 22:16. The few slight changes from the Septuagint do not affect the sense. I will surely bless you reflects the Hebrew infinitive absolute. So Abraham will be surely blessed, which conveys the ideas of emphasis and certainty. This is the first occurrence of the word blessed in this epistle. The author will use it 7 times in all, and as many as in all of the Pauline epistles put together, and exceeded in the New Testament only by Luke. All he's counting. Sometimes it is used of people when it means invoke blessings on, or sometimes give thanks. But where God is the subject, the meaning is bless, prosper. Here the blessing refers to descendants who would form a great nation, possess the land, the promised land, and in due course be the source of blessing to others. Not yet approaching that. But when Christ comes again, all Israel will be blessed, and we will see how transformed the Israelites and those in that generation, just shortly from now, will be and live 1,000 years, know the Word of God perfectly, and be perfect, sinless beings. Wow. So, in verse 15, should not be taken too closely with waiting patiently. It is not so much waiting thus, as thus confident in God's promise he waited patiently. Abraham was content to await God's time for the fulfillment of the promise. Wow. Should I be that way? Wow. What an example. This meant real patience, because Isaac was not born until 25 years after the promise was first given. And that signifies what? That the descendancy will be through Isaac, and it'll be Christ, and he'll pay the penalty for our sins, all humanity, and especially Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Israel. The new covenant, right, between God and Israel, and blessed of all eternity, all mankind, who trust alone in him alone, because sins are paid for all mankind. And long after Sarah could have been expected to bear children, Abraham's grandchildren were not born for another 60 years, only 15 years before his death. The complete fulfillment of the promise, of course, could not take place within his lifetime. A nation cannot be born so quickly. But enough happened for the writer to say Abraham received what was promised. God taking an oath. Absolutely. And that oath began with Isaac. But after 25 years of waiting, finally, and messing up with Eliezer and then Hagar, he waited 25 years, and there's Isaac and Jacob and Israel. And first century, Jesus Christ dying for the sins of the whole world. There was a promise before that. We should possibly bear in mind also John 8:56. Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. Wow, how much maturity did he reach from Eliezer on, from the days of Ur of the Chaldees, to now he's with the Lord. And we see not yet the fulfillment, that generation of all of Israel believing in the Lord coming and his sacrifice for sins through the seed of Abraham, who's Christ. In that sense, Abraham saw the fuller working out of the promise. But the important thing in the present context is that Abraham had to be patient if he was to see anything in the way of fulfillment. He was patient, and he did see it. So the readers are encouraged to be patient and await God's action. He does not go back on his promises. The readers are the Hebrew Christians, and for us as well, Gentile Christians. He is completely reliable, but he works in his own way and time, and not ours. Bible Knowledge Commentary on these same verses 11 to 15. We've read these. 11 to 12. If they would only diligently hold on to the good course they already were pursuing, and of which God was fully mindful, they would thus guarantee the hope which is duly awarded to those who so persevere. More and more and more now, as I'm getting to be 82 now, I'm 81, I realize perseverance is all important, despite me getting older and being under all kinds of problems, physically declining, but you persevere in the faith. He added, we do not want you to become lazy. The word lazy is the same word rendered slow in 5:11, Hebrew 5:11, in the phrase slow to learn. The sluggishness which marked their immaturity was to be shrugged off. We do not want you to be lazy rather than become lazy. Their real goal should be the inheritance that is set before them, the promised land, and all kinds of other eternal blessings. They were to be imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit God's promises. Not like that first generation. 6:13 to 15. If the readers were searching for models to imitate, there was the case of Abraham, who received an oath from God, the promise that assured the multiplication of his seed. In due time, his patience was rewarded in that he received the promise. Isaac, since the reference is to the promise given in Genesis 22:17 after the offering of Isaac, the author may have been thinking of the reception of the promise itself as the reward. In that the case, the idea is that after Abraham had patiently endured the test involving Isaac, he obtained the promise. Waiting patiently translates the participle in the Greek related to the noun patience in Hebrews 6:12. This word, common in the New Testament, refers to the ability to hold one's feelings in restraint without retaliation against others. A synonym Endurance, perseverance means the ability to remain steadfast in the face of undesirable circumstances, like